History handed us a convenient filter, but the truth is far darker. Seppuku is usually remembered as the purest expression of samurai honor, a final act of courage in which a warrior proved sincerity through pain and self-destruction. But the historical record is less romantic. During the long peace of the Edo period, seppuku increasingly functioned as a formalized punishment, and under the Tokugawa order, it could serve as an upper-class death sentence rather than some spontaneous triumph of private virtue. That changes the meaning of the ritual completely. If the state executes a dangerous man, it risks creating outrage, clan resentment, and a political memory that can outlive the corpse. But if the same man is ordered, encouraged, or cornered into killing himself inside a ritual framed as dignity, responsibility, and self-command, the regime achieves something far more efficient. It removes the threat while making the victim appear complicit in his own erasure. This is the paradox at the center of seppuku. It was not always the sacred language of honor that produced the ritual. Often it was the needs of power, order, and social control that wrapped violence in ceremony. The government did not always need to crush a samurai publicly as a criminal when it could let him die as a noble man under the rules the system itself had shaped. To understand seppuku, you have to stop looking at Japan as a stage filled with lone warriors and start seeing it as a circulation system of grain, rank, surveillance, and controlled violence. In the Edo period, power did not mainly flow from abstract ideals. It flowed through land assessments, rice yields, castle towns, roads, registries, and the political geometry that tied provincial domains to Edo. The map was not neutral, it was a machine. Every fief was measured in kokudaka, the assessed output of land expressed in koku of rice, and that assessment determined income, status, military obligations, and the relative weight of a lord inside the wider order. That is where the real story begins. Rice was not just food. Rice was taxation, bureaucracy, and social mathematics. One koku was treated as roughly enough to feed one person for a year, but in practice, kokudaka was more than a nutritional estimate. It was a political language that converted territory into obligation. A domain's official productivity established what its daimyo could claim, what it owed, how many retainers he could sustain, and how seriously he would be treated by the regime above him. When land becomes arithmetic, human beings become entries in a system. Samurai stipends, peasant burdens, and elite prestige all begin to depend on the same measured harvest. Now place that system on the roads of Japan. The Tokugawa Shogunate did not rely on trust, it relied on movement under supervision. Through sankin kotai, alternate attendants, daimyo had to divide their lives between their own domains and Edo, the political center where the shogun watched, counted, and constrained them. This did more than demonstrate loyalty. It drained resources, forced lords into predictable patterns, exposed their households to scrutiny, and made regional power legible to the center. A proud warlord in the provinces was no longer just a military actor. He became part of an audited network of attendance, expense, and ritual obedience. Inside that world, seppuku was not an isolated moral performance. It was one component in a larger architecture of control. Once a government has already quantified land, ranked houses, monitored mobility, and disciplined political behavior, it does not need death to be chaotic. It needs death to be administratively useful. A samurai who became a liability could be neutralized without the messy symbolism of common criminal execution. The ritual transformed punishment into self-punishment, coercion into apparent consent, and state force into a performance of internalized duty. That is what made it so effective. It fit the map, it fit the ledger, it fit the system. This is why romantic images of solitary honor miss the scale of what was really happening. The warrior kneeling in white robes was only the visible tip of a much larger structure beneath him. Peasant production feeding stipends, assessed land feeding rank, roads feeding surveillance, and ceremony feeding legitimacy. The state did not merely command bodies, it arranged the meanings attached to those bodies. It made obedience feel dignified, and it made elimination look ceremonial. In that sense, seppuku was not outside government, it was government, translated into flesh. Cinema teaches the eye to love seppuku before the mind has time to question it. The room is quiet, the robes are white, the witness circle is solemn, and the condemned man appears to seize control of his own ending with almost supernatural calm. The scene is framed as spiritual clarity under pressure, as though death itself has been purified by etiquette. That is the myth. Pain transformed into beauty, coercion transformed into dignity, and a political technology transformed into a moral ideal. But that image is a retrospective construction, built from later ideas of samurai virtue and from the broader romantic packaging of Bushido, much of which was formalized and idealized long after the most chaotic centuries of warfare had passed. The reality is harder, uglier, and more useful to power. Bushido was never one universally fixed, timeless code that governed every warrior across every century in the way modern audiences imagine. The very language of a singular way of the warrior was shaped and systematized over time, especially in the Edo period, when the shogunate had strong incentives to convert a once violent military class into a disciplined social hierarchy with moral obligations attached to obedience. That matters because once later ideology paints samurai behavior as naturally governed by honor, the state no longer looks coercive when it channels a man towards self-destruction. It looks as though it is merely allowing him to remain true to himself. And that is the trick. Seppuku, in popular imagination, appears as the ultimate expression of free will, but historically it could function inside systems where choice was narrow, managed, and politically loaded. A samurai ordered to die by seppuku was not standing outside authority. He was being processed through its highest status form of punishment. The ritual did not erase domination, it concealed domination under choreography. White garments, formal witnesses, final words, prescribed gestures, and the presence of a kaishakunin did not make the act less violent. They made the violence legible, repeatable, and culturally defensible. This was not transcendence above politics. This was politics, refined into theater. Romantic storytelling also isolates the samurai from the material world around him, as if the act emerged from some internal reservoir of pure conviction. But samurai were not mythic entities floating above institutions. They were members of a status group bound by payroll, land assessments, family reputation, and obligations to superiors. Their conduct was never just about inner belief, it was shaped by consequences. A dishonored death could stain a house, damage descendants, and redraw the relationship between retainers and lord. A ritualized death, by contrast, could contain that damage, preserving fragments of name and structure even as it extinguished the body. This is not proof of honor in the abstract. It is proof that social pressure can make annihilation appear rational. So the real contrast is not honor versus cowardice. It is spectacle versus mechanics. The spectacle gives you a kneeling warrior and a noble last breath. The mechanics give you a state that understood symbols well enough to turn elite punishment into self-administered obedience. The spectacle says the samurai died for principle. The mechanics ask, who benefited from a system in which armed men could be removed without public criminal degradation, while their families, peers, and rivals all absorbed the lesson? This was never just about what a man believed as he faced the blade. It was about what everyone else learned by watching him do it. That is why the romance survives so well. It flatters everyone. It flatters the dead by calling them noble. It flatters the rulers by making coercion look civilized. It flatters later audiences by giving them a clean moral narrative instead of a contaminated political one. But the historical truth does not offer that comfort. Seppuku was not sacred because it stood above the system. It became powerful because it was perfectly adapted to the system, a ritual that made domination appear voluntary, suffering appear meaningful, and fear appear honorable. If seppuku survived and hardened into a political instrument, it did not do so because abstract honor floated above material life. It survived because it fit the economics of the Tokugawa order. Follow the money, and the ritual stops looking like a spiritual mystery. It starts looking like an answer to a very expensive problem. How do you govern a country full of hereditary military elites after large-scale war has ended, when those elites still expect status, income, deference, and a reason to exist? The shogunate could not simply erase the samurai class because that class had been one of the foundations of power itself. But it could convert warriors into salaried functionaries, tie their existence to stipends and rank, and then discipline them through a social system in which disgrace could be monetized as efficiently as loyalty. The key to that system was kokudaka, the rice-based assessment that translated land into official productivity. A domain's value was not primarily its beauty, its ancient prestige, or its legends. Its value was what it could yield, what it could be taxed for, and what that tax could sustain in terms of administration, retainers, obligations, and political standing. Rice became the bloodstream of the regime. Samurai stipends were linked to this broader architecture of assessed output, meaning that the ruling order had to keep the warrior class intact enough to serve, but controlled enough not to devour the system that fed it. Seppuku enters here not as an isolated custom, but as a pressure valve inside a rice-calculated hierarchy. That hierarchy was expensive to maintain. Alternate attendance, or sankin kotai, forced daimyo to spend staggering amounts on travel, residences, processions, and the maintenance of households split between domain and Edo. This was not waste by accident. The burden itself helped weaken regional power and prevented lords from accumulating too much independent military capacity. A daimyo who had to pour resources into display and compliance had less room to finance rebellion. But that same system also intensified pressure downward. If a lord was financially strained, his retainers felt it. If the domain economy tightened, samurai income, family stability, and factional tensions all tightened with it. Economic compression produces political danger, especially when the people being squeezed are armed and status conscious. Now the logic of seppuku becomes clearer. In a world where rank and livelihood were inseparable from reputation, punishment had to do more than remove an offender. It had to manage the fiscal and symbolic fallout. A formal criminal execution could humiliate an entire house, inflame loyalty networks, and destabilize the delicate balance between central authority and local elite cooperation. Ordered seppuku, by contrast, could neutralize an individual while partially preserving the fiction that the social body remained honorable. It was punishment packaged as self-regulation. It reduced the need for crude coercion while protecting the accounting structure beneath the surface. A dead samurai could still serve the system if his death prevented wider disorder. There is another layer here, one that began earlier in the Age of War and reshaped the very environment from which Tokugawa order emerged. Portuguese contact and the introduction of firearms transformed the economics of conflict in the Sengoku period. Guns were not just weapons, they were force multipliers, trade goods, and strategic assets that favored organization, supply, and procurement over purely aristocratic bravado. Warfare became increasingly tied to logistics, manufacturing, and commerce, which meant that the rulers who eventually unified Japan inherited a political landscape already reconfigured by material competition. When the Tokugawa regime consolidated peace, it also inherited the challenge of governing men formed by a militarized economy no longer allowed to operate at full intensity. So no, seppuku was not an antique moral ornament lingering unchanged from a timeless past. It was compatible with a fiscal state that measured land, allocated stipends, disciplined lords through cost, and feared the consequences of idle military status. The samurai was not simply a believer in honor, he was a rational actor inside a feudal logistics machine, trapped between income, duty, lineage, and surveillance. And the regime above him was equally rational. It understood that the cheapest rebellion is the one that never begins. The cheapest execution is the one the condemned appears to perform himself. And the most efficient control system is the one that makes obedience feel like identity. The true power of seppuku was not metaphysical, it was mechanical. Its advantage lay in procedure, timing, witness structure, and the careful engineering of perception. A crude execution simply kills a body. Seppuku, especially in its codified Edo period forms, did something more sophisticated. It staged death so that the condemned appeared to accept the logic of the system, even while being destroyed by it. That is why the ritual mattered. It was not just lethal, it was narratively efficient. It turned punishment into a script, and once punishment becomes a script, authority no longer has to argue for itself every time it spills blood. Start with the body. Popular imagination suggests that seppuku meant a warrior cutting open his abdomen and dying through sheer endurance. In practice, that image is deeply misleading. Britannica's description makes clear that the abdominal cuts were excruciating and slow, and it goes further. Simply cutting into the stomach did not reliably cause immediate death, which is one reason the kaishakunin, the assistant who decapitated the condemned, became central to the ritual. This is the first mechanical truth that destroys the romantic myth. The visible gesture of self-killing was often not the actual terminal mechanism. The ritual depended on a second man, positioned behind the condemned, ready to convert symbolic self-destruction into real death. That second man was not a side character, he was the mechanism. The kaishakunin had to strike at exactly the right moment and with exactly the right force. Too early, and the ritual looked fraudulent. Too late, and the condemned suffered visibly, perhaps screaming, convulsing, or collapsing in humiliation before witnesses. Too clumsy, and the spectacle became grotesque in the wrong way, not controlled terror, but embarrassing incompetence. Even the technique of decapitation was calibrated to appearance. The assistant was expected to deliver a near-complete beheading while preserving bodily dignity, because uncontrolled mutilation could strip the act of its intended meaning. This was choreography under extreme pressure, where a single bad stroke could destroy the illusion of composure the state needed the audience to believe. Then comes the question of substitution, which is where the system becomes almost clinically intelligent. The documents the spread of sensubara, or fan seppuku, in the Edo period, where the condemned might hold a fan in place of a blade, and the assistant would step in at the signal to perform the decapitation. Think about what that means. By that point, the ritual no longer required even the full physical act of abdominal disembowelment to preserve its social value. The form survived after the substance had been hollowed out. The body no longer had to prove sincerity through prolonged agony. The ceremony only had to preserve the appearance that the condemned accepted responsibility. This is not a detail at the margins. It is the entire system exposed. Once a ritual can be replaced by a prop while retaining its legitimacy, its primary function is no longer moral proof. Its primary function is symbolic compliance. Witnesses completed the machine. Obligatory seppuku was commonly performed in the presence of officials or appointed observers, including a kenshi sent by the authority issuing the sentence. This meant death was not private repentance, it was audited destruction. The witnesses authenticated that the condemned had submitted properly, that the status hierarchy had been obeyed, and that the final image entering political memory would be one of order rather than struggle. The room itself was part of the mechanism: tatami mats, a small table, the weapon placed in front, the assistant behind, the officials around. Nothing here was incidental. The space was engineered to make authority look calm, clean, and superior, while the condemned performed the labor of validating the system with his own body. This is why seppuku outperformed ordinary execution as a control technology. It solved multiple problems at once. It eliminated the offender. It preserved distinctions between elite and common punishment. It reduced the spectacle of overt state brutality by outsourcing the initiating gesture to the condemned. And it instructed everyone present that even death inside the warrior class would occur according to rank, discipline, and ritual form. The genius of the mechanism was that it did not merely punish disobedience, it forced the condemned to participate in the aesthetic of obedience. That is not honor, that is design. And once you see the design, the ritual stops looking ancient and mystical. It starts looking modern in the most disturbing possible way. Branding experts understand that the strongest message is the one the target repeats himself. Political regimes understand that the most stable obedience is the kind that feels self-chosen. Seppuku fused those principles centuries before modern marketing language existed. The blade, the fan, the witness, the assistant, the room, the timing, the final posture, all of it formed a delivery system for one message. Power does not need to drag you screaming if it can teach you to die in a way that proves its values for it. By the time seppuku reached its most codified forms, it no longer existed in a vacuum of personal morality. It lived inside a legal architecture designed to freeze Japan after generations of war. The Tokugawa regime did not merely defeat rivals and declare peace. It built a social contract backed by law, surveillance, and inherited role assignment. The buke shohato, the laws for the military houses, were central to that design. Issued in 1615 and updated afterward, they regulated daimyo and the broader warrior class, defining conduct, loyalty, and responsibility in ways that made samurai identity inseparable from discipline under the shogunate. That matters because the Tokugawa state did not promise freedom in exchange for order. It promised stability in exchange for submission to structure. Samurai were expected to behave as a governing warrior aristocracy, but under rules that sharply limited how independently they could act. Daimyo remained local rulers inside their domains, yet their authority endured only at the pleasure of the shogun, who could intervene, transfer, or strip them of position if they became dangerous or disobedient. In other words, the system preserved elite status while emptying it of much of its old military autonomy. Power remained visible in the hands of warrior houses, but it was increasingly framed, measured, and conditional. This is where seppuku becomes legible as part of a legal order rather than an isolated ethical impulse. A regime built on rank has to punish differently across rank. Commoners could be treated as common criminals. But samurai, as the upper military stratum of society, needed a disciplinary mechanism that reaffirmed hierarchy even while enforcing obedience. Ordered seppuku solved that problem elegantly. It marked the condemned as guilty or failed, but not in the same register as an ordinary felon. The ritual preserved class distinction at the exact moment the state exercised lethal force. It said, "You will die, but you will die in a way that confirms the social grammar we rule by." The larger class system reinforced that grammar everywhere. Edo society was commonly ordered into hereditary strata, samurai at the top, then peasants, artisans, and merchants below, with additional groups existing outside or alongside those classifications. This arrangement was not a simple reflection of wealth. It reflected Tokugawa values about productivity, order, and social function. Farmers ranked above merchants not because they were richer, but because rice production fed the entire taxation structure on which warrior rule depended. The system's message was blunt. Every person had a role, every role had a place, and disorder began the moment anyone forgot the script. Seen from that angle, seppuku was a kind of terminal legal punctuation. It was the final enforcement of the rule that identity itself was administered. A samurai did not merely belong to a family or carry a sword. He inhabited a juridical role with obligations that could culminate in ritualized self-annihilation if violated. This made the punishment extraordinarily powerful because it was not experienced as purely external. It invaded self-conception. The warrior was taught that preserving the form of the order, even through his own destruction, was preferable to disrupting it through open defiance. That is the hallmark of a mature control system, not just punishing bodies, but teaching people to interpret punishment as the rightful consequence of their place. There is a dark elegance in that arrangement. After 1.5 centuries of civil war, the shogunate offered a brutal alternative to chaos. Everyone remains where they are told, everyone performs the duties attached to their station, and the threat of violence is kept mostly invisible because it has already been absorbed into law and custom. But invisible violence does not become less real, it becomes more efficient. Seppuku in this framework was not a breakdown of order, it was one of order's sharpest tools, because it transformed elite death into a lesson about the cost of stepping outside the roles the state had written. So when later generations romanticized the ritual as private honor, they erased the system that gave it force. The truth is less flattering and more revealing. Seppuku was powerful not because it stood above law, but because it embodied law at the level of flesh. The warrior's last act did not liberate him from structure. It proved that the structure had penetrated so deeply that even death could be made to look like cooperation. Long before modern governments learned to manage populations through image, costume, choreography, and controlled messaging, warrior Japan already understood something essential. Fear is most efficient when it is recognizable. A threat becomes stronger the moment it develops branding. On the battlefield, that branding appeared in banners, crests, helmets, lacquered armor, and menpo masks designed not only to protect the face, but to shape what the enemy thought he was seeing. Sashimono and other war banners allowed forces to identify units and allegiances in the chaos of combat, while heraldic symbols turned clans into instantly legible visual entities. Menpo did something darker. They made commanders and warriors look less like men and more like controlled monsters, with grimacing expressions, exaggerated wrinkles, mustaches, and teeth meant to distort the human face into a weapon of intimidation. That same logic of visual control survived beyond the battlefield and found one of its purest expressions in seppuku. The ritual did not merely kill, it communicated. It told every witness, every retainer, every rival house, and every official in the room what happened to a warrior who stepped outside the acceptable boundaries of conduct. And it told them this through spectacle rather than proclamation. Publicly or semi-publicly witnessed self-destruction carries a special force because it appears to prove a principle without explanation. No decree sounds as powerful as a body obeying the system while dying under it. In that sense, seppuku was a message delivery system aimed not only at the condemned, but at the political imagination of everyone around him. This is why shame and reputation mattered so much. In societies organized through hereditary rank, symbolic capital can be as decisive as military force. A samurai's body was not only his own, it was tied to lineage, dependence, memory, and the standing of his house. A ritual death performed properly could preserve fragments of dignity where open criminal punishment might annihilate them completely. But that partial preservation was itself part of the trap. It made the ritual emotionally and socially intelligible. The condemned could be made to feel that self-destruction was the last remaining way to control the narrative around his failure. That is one of the cruelest mechanisms of all, convincing the target that the branded version of his own elimination is preferable to resisting it. Now, compare that with battlefield branding. A banner tells you who is coming. A menpo tells you what kind of nightmare is moving toward you. Seppuku did something similar in the political sphere. It told the elite class what kind of state they lived under. Not a state that screamed, not a state that flailed, a state so composed that it could let rank, ritual, and self-image do much of the work of coercion. That is terrifying in a deeper way than simple brutality. Any ruler can threaten punishment. Only a sophisticated system can make punishment appear self-authored, dignified, and even admirable to onlookers. This is where the phrase marketing campaign becomes more than metaphor. Marketing is not just selling a product, it is controlling interpretation at scale. It is teaching people what symbols mean, what emotions attach to them, and what behavior seems natural inside that symbolic world. Seppuku marketed obedience to the warrior class in the language that warrior class most wanted to hear: dignity, resolve, discipline, self-command, responsibility. The regime did not need to tell samurai they were slaves to the system. It told them they were honorable men. Then it built a ritual that weaponized that self-image against them. And like all powerful branding, it worked because it fused aesthetics with consequence. The white robe, the blade, the witness, the final bow of the head, the precision of the kaishaku, the absence of disorder, each element reinforced the same emotional conclusion. This is the proper end of a failed warrior. This is what seriousness looks like. This is what legitimacy looks like. That repetition matters. Once the image is culturally stabilized, it no longer feels imposed, it feels inevitable. Fear then stops operating only at the level of pain. It begins operating at the level of expectation, where everyone already knows how the scene ends before the blade is even lifted. So the most effective terror was not always the loudest. Sometimes it wore a composed face. Sometimes it arrived in beautiful ceremony. Sometimes it asked the condemned to cooperate in producing the image that would scare the next man into obedience. That is the dark brilliance of seppuku as political branding. The victim did not merely disappear, he became the advertisement. The sanitized version of seppuku is one of the most successful lies ever told about ritual violence. It removes the body from the event. It removes smell, trembling, failed timing, spasm, blood loss and the awful fact that cutting open the abdomen is not a poetic gesture, but a catastrophic injury. Britannica describes the act in anatomical terms. The abdomen was cut with a short blade, sometimes followed by an additional cut below the sternum. That sounds clinical on the page. In a room, it would have been something else entirely. A wet tearing of tissue, a shock wave of pain through the torso, muscles collapsing against instinct, breathing shattered into fragments. This was not a beautiful death. It was the body being forced to contradict every survival reflex it possessed. And then there was the kaishaku, the assistant, whose role supposedly made the ritual merciful. That word, merciful, hides almost as much as the word honor. The kaishakunin stood ready to end the condemned man's suffering by striking at the precise moment agony became intolerable. But precision here meant a very particular brutality. Accounts of kaishaku emphasized that the head was often not meant to be fully severed. A skilled strike could leave a strip of skin intact so the head would not tumble away across the floor in a degrading spectacle. Think about the logic of that. Even at the instant of decapitation, aesthetics still governed flesh. The goal was not simply death, the goal was a death arranged to look controlled. Which means everything depended on competence. A good kaishakunin could transform unbearable torment into a sharp, abrupt ending. A bad one turned ceremony into nightmare. Too hesitant, and the condemned remained conscious in a body already opened by the blade. Too imprecise, and the neck might take more than one attempt. Too forceful or poorly angled, and the body could collapse in a way that shattered the script of composure the witnesses expected. The ritual's reputation for dignity rested on the edge of technical failure, and that failure would have been visible to everyone in the room. What later memory calls solemnity was in real time an unstable performance balanced over screaming pain and irreversible mutilation. Now, widen the frame. Edo period Japan already knew how to use punishment as spectacle. Public execution, public shaming, and parading criminals before death were part of a larger penal environment in which authority made suffering legible to crowds. Seppuku differed in status, but not in its underlying relationship to theater. It was still an event arranged for viewers. It still carried lessons. It still translated power into a physical scene. The difference was that common punishment displayed the criminal body as polluted and broken, while seppuku displayed the elite body as disciplined and self-submitting. But both forms relied on the same human substrate, fear generated by watching what institutions can do to flesh. And flesh is always louder than ideology. Imagine the room as it really was. Tatami absorbing blood, metal carrying a thin smell of oil and iron, white cloth losing its purity in seconds, witnesses holding composure because composure itself is part of the script, a sword stroke landing with enough force to cut through the back of the neck but not fully send the head rolling, the final slump of the body, the silence after impact, not sacred silence, but the silence people use when they are pretending not to react to horror. This is the reality hidden beneath the polished language. Ritual does not remove terror. It frames terror so it can be consumed without destabilizing the system that produced it. That is why seppuku worked so powerfully as a control mechanism. It fused elite aesthetics with primal disgust. The condemned man was made to participate in his own destruction, but everyone else still had to watch what destruction actually looked like. They saw the body opened. They saw the neck struck. They saw that the system could make a man cooperate right up to the threshold where instinct should have torn the whole performance apart. This is not merely punishment. It is theatrical violence optimized for memory. And once that image enters culture, it becomes almost impossible to erase. People stop remembering the smell and start remembering the meaning assigned to the smell. They stop remembering the ruined body and start remembering the word honor. That is how brutal systems survive longest, not by hiding their violence completely, but by teaching later generations to aestheticize it. Every glorious image of samurai order rests on something historians and popular culture too often push to the margins. Somebody had to pay for the peace. Somebody had to finance the stipends, the roads, the castle towns, the processions, the pageantry, the bureaucratic machinery, and the elite rituals of discipline that made Tokugawa rule look stable and inevitable. That somebody was not the samurai class itself. It was the productive base beneath it, above all, the peasantry, whose labor fed the rice tax system that underwrote warrior status and state power. The polished language of honor only makes sense once you understand the darker substrate below it. Coercion did not begin at the moment a samurai took the blade to his stomach. It began in the fields. Rice was not simply food in this world. It was convertible power. Land assessments, taxes, stipends, status rankings, and obligations were all bound up in the kokudaka logic that translated agricultural productivity into political reality. That meant the daily exhaustion of peasants was not a side note to samurai culture, it was its enabling condition. Farmers were ranked high in the social hierarchy not because the system respected their freedom, but because the system depended on their output. Their harvests sustained the fiscal architecture of the domains and, by extension, the warrior class above them. A society that publicly glorified elite sacrifice was privately extracting value from millions who would never be allowed to narrate the meaning of their own suffering. Now, look at the castles. Modern viewers see Himeji, Osaka, Edo, or the great fortresses of the Unification era and think of strategic genius, aesthetic grandeur, and national heritage. But castles were not neutral monuments. They were engines of administration and domination, and they required staggering quantities of labor and materials. Britannica notes that daimyo were compelled to assist in major public works, including castle construction in Bakufu territories, a burden that also kept them financially weakened. World History Encyclopedia goes further for Edo Castle. Daimyo were ordered to provide labor and materials in proportion to their revenues, which means every clean stone line and every graceful rampart was tied to an extraction system reaching downward through lords, retainers, and laborers. Beauty here was not separate from coercion. Beauty was coercion, mineralized. This is the hidden connection most romantic narratives avoid. The same order that turned seppuku into a dignified-looking technology of elite control also transformed land, labor, and architecture into visible proof of hierarchy. A castle did not merely defend territory, it announced who had the right to command bodies on a massive scale. A samurai's ritual death did not merely protect his name, it reaffirmed a society in which prestige at the top was constantly subsidized by work at the bottom. The fields fed the stipends fed the warrior bureaucracy. The warrior bureaucracy enforced the order that kept the fields productive. It was a loop, and seppuku belonged to that loop. That is why there are no clean heroes in this story. The shogunate stabilized Japan after devastating warfare, yes. It also froze social mobility, disciplined domains through financial pressure, and preserved a hereditary hierarchy whose elegance depended on unequal burdens. The samurai were not simply noble guardians trapped by their own ideals. Many were also beneficiaries of an extractive system that kept them above those who produced the resources they consumed. Even their most theatrical acts of self-destruction took place within a social order already financed by people who had no comparable right to ritual dignity. And this is where the myth of honor becomes most morally convenient. It directs attention upward toward elite pain, elite codes, elite endings. It asks us to contemplate the warrior's conscience while ignoring the labor structure that made the warrior possible. It turns political economy into character drama. But the real historical picture is colder. Castles were built because labor could be mobilized. Samurai held status because taxes could be extracted. Seppuku carried symbolic weight because the system had already convinced society that some deaths were more meaningful than others. Once you see that chain clearly, the ritual stops looking like the pinnacle of civilization. It starts looking like one polished surface on top of a deeply unequal machine. If you want to see how seppuku really functioned, do not start with abstract philosophy. Start with a young man trapped inside protocol. In 1701, Asano Naganori, daimyo of Akko, attacked the shogunate official Kira Yoshinaka inside Edo Castle after a period of tension tied to court instruction and etiquette. For that act, Asano was ordered to commit seppuku almost immediately. Kira, the man at the center of the conflict, was not punished in the same way. Right there, the mythology begins to crack. If seppuku were simply the natural flowering of samurai honor, then the event would read like a moral drama about one man's noble responsibility. In reality, it was also a demonstration of how quickly the system could intervene, define guilt, and transform a political embarrassment into a controlled elite death. Asano was only 26 when he died. Try to strip away the legend for a moment and return him to the scale of a human body. A young lord inside a fortress city governed by ceremony, rank, and surveillance loses control in the wrong room against the wrong man under the eyes of the wrong system. Within hours, his future is gone, his household is destabilized, his retainers are thrown into uncertainty, and his body is redirected into ritual. That speed matters. It shows that seppuku was not merely a private moral option waiting patiently on the shelf of tradition. It was an available instrument of state response, ready to convert disorder into an ending the regime could classify as proper. Then come the men left behind. Asano's retainers became Rōnin, masterless samurai, and the social meaning of their existence changed overnight. This is where the human tragedy deepens, because the story of the 47 Rōnin is often told as the greatest example of loyalty in Japanese culture. And yes, they did wait, plan, and eventually kill Kira in retaliation before surrendering themselves. But look more closely, and the story becomes less like a hymn to virtue and more like a chain reaction set off by a system that left men with almost no honorable path except further bloodshed. Their lord had been processed through ritual death. Their own identities, reputations, and sense of duty were now suspended in the aftermath. Revenge was not simply passion, it was also a way of re-entering a moral universe that had already been weaponized against them. What happened next is the most revealing part. After killing Kira, the Rōnin turned themselves in, and most of them were also sentenced to die by seppuku rather than executed like ordinary criminals. That decision tells you almost everything about the regime. The shogunate could not openly celebrate private vendetta because that would undermine its monopoly on order, but it also could not ignore the emotional force of samurai loyalty surrounding the case. So it chose the most politically elegant solution available. Punish the avengers, but punish them in the high-status language of ritual death. The state condemned their disobedience while partially validating their social rank. Once again, seppuku functioned as a bridge between coercion and legitimacy. This is why the Akko incident endured so powerfully in cultural memory. It looks like a story about devotion, but beneath that surface it is a story about entrapment. A lord is driven into ritual death by court politics and shogunal authority. His men are stripped of status, then pulled by loyalty, expectation, and social shame toward revenge. Their revenge then becomes the justification for another round of ritualized self-elimination. One act produces another until the system has consumed nearly everyone involved, while posterity praises the beauty of their conduct. That is the tragedy. The dead are canonized so effectively that the machinery which killed them becomes almost invisible. And Asano himself, at the center of it all, becomes strangely inaccessible in the legend built around him. He is remembered less as a frightened, angry, constrained 26-year-old human being than as the spark that activated a national morality play. But real people do not experience their lives as legends. They experience them as pressure, humiliation, uncertainty, rage, and irreversible consequence. Seppuku did not elevate Asano beyond politics. It swallowed him inside politics, then handed later generations a cleaner story than the one his body actually lived through. Seppuku disappeared as a formal institution, but the logic behind it did not vanish so neatly. The Tokugawa period left Japan with a deep legacy of structured hierarchy, disciplined roles, and a social imagination in which loyalty, endurance, and self-control carried enormous moral weight. Later ideas of Bushido continued to shape how samurai values were remembered, and that memory still echoes in modern discussions of duty, work ethic, hierarchy, and national identity, even if the original ritual itself no longer functions as a living norm. What survived was not simply the blade. What survived was the dangerous beauty of systems that teach people to call obedience virtue. That is why this history still matters. Once a culture learns how to package pressure as dignity, sacrifice as identity, and self-destruction as proof of seriousness, the form can change while the mechanism stays recognizable. If this kind of historical autopsy matters to you, subscribe and stay here, because the textbooks usually preserve the costume and hide the machinery. And now the real question is the one history never asks politely. What shocked you more, the brutality of the ritual itself, or the fact that power became strongest the moment it convinced people to destroy themselves in its name?